put in power the fact that those that are lack of effort or trying. But rather than dwell in doom and gloom, this is really a moment, especially because South Africa and the AU has now joined the club of 20, for Africa to speak in a united voice. That is the first thing that I want to suggest. And there are two ways in which, in my view, Africa is to speak in a united voice. I mean, one of the things that happens when we are in gatherings like COP is the fact that we go very fragmented. And every country wants breadcrumbs to what is being offered on the table. Here is a moment where South Africa and the AU need to come together and really start putting issues that concern Africa on the table. We can be very divided as South Africans, but if Twitter is any indication, yesterday when we got that little clip from the American president about the things that are happening in our land, the unity that came to say, first, we are a sovereign country, and do not touch us where land is concerned, because this carries quite a lot of deep-seated hurt about dispossession. Now, this was about South Africa, but I think the same unity that was evident yesterday is the same unity that we need to show about the scramble for resources in Africa where we are portrayed in a particular manner. So the first thing is speak as Africa in a united voice around key issues that Brazil fortunately put on the table, and additional others like debt transparency and stopping illicit financial growth. The second thing that we need to do is to sort out and put our house in order as Africa. I think this is not a G20 of finance minister, this is not a G20 of president, this must be the people's G20. So how are we ensuring that in the different African countries, even at AU level, the most affected, who are mainly women in rural areas, also have a voice in G20 measures? And that is why W20, Y20, and C20 in particular has to make sure that it adheres to the principle of inclusivity and leave nobody behind, so that all the voices, and we create an enabling environment for all of the voices to be heard. I mean, Oxfam and even with the Brazil presidency started a campaign which demonstrated through data that if you tax the super rich, where right now they are paying very little taxes, they've got tax havens in different countries, etc., etc., you will be able to put a lot of funding in social goods. We are having a lot of countries, and some of the studies that Oxfam has produced, who are taking loans that have got no transparency from the World Bank, IMF, and others, and as a result, they adopt austerity measures that will make them disinvest in social scaling. We saw Brazil put on the agenda the issues of hunger on the table, and we hope that that agenda is going to be seen to carry forward. Where climate change and energy is concerned, we need to understand the gendered nature of energy poverty. We need to understand how it further marginalizes rural communities. And that just transition cannot only be talking about technologies, and we are also going to have to talk about how do we build resilience in communities like in South Africa, Witbank and others that have relied on coal, but now we are saying we are transitioning. So we are going to have to make sure that our economy and the current economy that does not put people and planet at the fore is not sustainable. And I think we implore on our leaders to start putting these issues on the table, but they cannot do this alone. and it can be a top-down approach, the interaction, and definitely making sure that Y20, T20, which are think tanks, and C20 in particular, are able to really take on these issues and make sure that there are working groups that can also suggest some policy directives to all the leaders. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, Sarah. It's interesting that you made reference to some of the priorities that were put forward by civil society in Brazil, including really profiling the role that civil society can play in amplifying calls around tax policies that are essentially equitable and really deliver for the people. Now, to move to Vista, effort that works at the intersection of tax and debt. And so, in terms of tax policies, can you talk to us a little bit of how they play a critical role in mobilizing domestic resources, as well as how this could be used to advance sustainable development? I mean, African countries essentially rely on revenue generation from tax. So how do we use this moment, which is the G20, to really influence outcomes around the energy transition and working groups?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for pushing it. I'm just building on what you said. I think that it's important for us to recognize that Africa's energy transition should not be funded in a way that deepens debt, inequality, vulnerability, or reinforces these dependencies. And so we must also then recognize that a tax system, tax reform doesn't happen within a year. As you've seen with the UN tax convention, it takes a long time, right? And just as one million news that the USA is pulling out of it, and then we have to ask again, what does that mean for us? Does it mean that we are leading this reform and we've pushed so hard for? I don't think so. I think that there are other avenues that we can try. And I think that's particularly such a critical moment for us. South Africa is hosting the G20. The AU is part of it for the first time. The AU's theme for this year, their own theme, is a year of declarations. It is also a jubilee year. And so these long-standing demands by civil society and its allies centered around debt cancellation, restructuring, centering Africa as rule makers, not rule takers, is something that we really need to push for. And then also what both of you said is that we need to build on what Brazil and other C20 counterparts have done in the years prior and putting these demands on the table, carrying them forward. We can only achieve so much in a year if we try and reinvent the wheel on our own. We have to work in partnership. We have to put building on what's already been done. So the demand for climate finance mechanisms that are centered around grant concessions is something that we should be going for. And I think two things that really stand out that we could be pushing for in this year to mitigate further debt in search of a just energy transition would be advocating for climate resilient sovereign debt framework. This was first brought up during the COP27 in 2017, I think. And this basically says, it goes back to 400,000 years. We were saying that if a debtor is unable to meet its payment requirements due to natural disasters, especially biblical times, then there should be the arrangement should then be catered to for that situation. So we're saying today in modern loan contracts, can we do that as well? And again, pushing the global north to their commitments, because we are seeing that this oligarch is super rich. They are just taking and taking and taking and leaving nothing for us. For example, I think it was at the last year's AMI, we had the same conversation where at the mining in Indaba, our leaders actually for the first time came together and said, yes, the global north has had their time to develop, what about us? And we see this unison also between leaders to say that we also need time to develop us on our own terms. So I think it's really a moment for that. And the G20 also provides us not really as a norm and agenda setting space. So it's also for us to push new agendas and to push the envelope on what is being said. So for example, when we're looking at the OECD is a permanent guest to the G20. They come, they're permanent guests of the G20, and that is also where we can say, listen, you need to reallocate the official development aid allocations. That it does provide provisions for climate disaster and risk and mitigation factors. And the same with IFIs, MDBs, multi-development banks. The IMF and the World Bank, they are also party to the G20. They also come and sit in on those meetings. So we can also then use the technique and tell them we need a reallocation of special drawing rights. These special drawing rights at the moment do not suit African needs, especially when it comes to energy and the just transition. We need to reallocate that and then leverage on climate resilience initiatives already in existence, like the climate fund. It's about continuity, it's about building together, and it's about collective advocacy effort to reduce countries' debt and not push them further into debt, ensuring that they can actually meet their own country's needs and then also avoid more austerity measures, which, as I said, will affect these countries at the back foot. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. We've heard about the gender impact of we've heard about the gender impact earlier from also in South Africa, particularly on energy poverty, and Rista outlined as well that there's a critical role that we as civil society need to play within the conversations around just energy transition. And so within that context, Jennifer, I look over to you to perhaps talk us through your thoughts in terms of, what role can the intersection of new economies presented by the just energy transition really play in addressing some of these gender disparities that we see, particularly given the high levels of poverty, escalating levels of inequality, racial inequality as well. So a little bit of reflections from your side, Jennifer, on where can we locate this work as civil society? How do we influence the various platforms that we have?
Thank you for that. I hope I'm audible. So I also thank you for allowing me to add my voice to this conversation. I want to start by saying that as we talk about the energy transition, I think it's important that we ask ourselves questions. A question, the reflections that we've been having since morning, and I think previous answers as well, and which is how are we collectively defining this energy transition? What are we transitioning into and from what, considering our history? But also, what are the politics and ideologies that are informing this transition? But most importantly, and I think also mentioned it as well, are we centering the role and agency of women and other structurally marginalized communities in this process of transitioning? And I think asking ourselves this question then allows us to not take the approach of the energy transition in terms of looking at it as a technical and green energy projects, but approach it about justice. So justice for Africa, justice for African women, but also justice for other structurally marginalized communities thinking about this. And I think this also then allows us to go back and start centering those voices and talk about shifting and reclaiming our power, but also looking at how we can redefine development through colonial, but also in terms of collective well-being, which is something that I will get into later on. And so thinking of that, and as we sit here today, and I know these are statistics that we're aware of in terms of energy inequality, we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, about 650 million people don't have access to energy, but also over 30 healthcare centers don't have access to sustainable electricity. And the problem with that is you find cases where people are dying in hospitals because power went out. Just imagine how tragic that is. You're in a hospital, power goes out, and someone dies. And thinking about it that way allows us to also see that this conversation about energy is not about looking at energy access as a commodity, but as a human right. We will start looking at it that way. And to add on to that as well, I think if we're thinking about this energy transition and bringing in the concept of gender is to say that we also need to look at the grants that women bear when it comes to energy justice. I think it was mentioned already, women are spending more time and resources in terms of collecting fuel to aid in their social and reproductive health, reproductive roles and responsibilities. And also, when we're talking about that, we need to add in the aspects of indigenous communities which have been dispossessed of their lands, but also denied the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to manage their own resources, but also to access the benefits of these that are accrued from their lands. So with that context, the point I'm trying to make is that we need to center women, we need to center indigenous communities, and also other structurally marginalized communities as we're thinking about priorities for the G20, but also more broadly in terms of the energy transition. And now going back to what then needs to happen and how do we bring in the concept of new economies. And I think that we need to acknowledge that we cannot achieve energy justice if we're not acknowledging the harm of and the limitations of the current global financial architecture, which perpetuates neoliberal capitalist interests, colonial legacies, but also patriarchal systems. And this then prevents women from and other structurally marginalized groups. And I keep centering that because it's important that we highlight all these other groups that are being affected by this. It prevents them from shaping their own economic futures. But at the same time, we also need to understand that this system was intentionally created to benefit the top 1%. I think it was already mentioned of wealth inequalities. It was meant to benefit the top 1% at the expense of the majority world. So those are also issues that we need to be highlighting as well. And so we need to understand that in terms of the G20 and the countries that are involved in that, is that we have to have common vision of what we're calling a just world. And this requires that we question and we interrogate the existing power inequalities as well as we think about alternatives. And then also comes in the ideas of the care economy, because we cannot be talking about energy transition without talking about the care economy. And so energy transition or just energy transition needs to acknowledge the care economy in that sense, but also the G20 must prioritize investing in energy solutions that center feminist ideologies and perspectives. For example, they need to redistribute and resource the care economy. So we know that care, it continues to be invisibilized, and also despite the fact that care subsidizes the market economy, and care is what sustains us. We're here today because of social reproduction, we're here because of the care economy, but it continues to be invisibilized. So that's something that we need to make sure that we're transforming in our conversations about energy transition. And then it's also important that we prioritize reparative justice, and I know Rizka mentioned this. We need to be looking at different financing mechanisms, so debt refinancing, debt cancellation, but also prioritizing progressive taxes and thinking about wealth taxes. I know this is something that wasn't prioritized, but it's also important that we highlight that. And going back to the issue of indigenous knowledge, that's something that we need to respect, we need to center in this process, we need to be thinking about those we need to be thinking about centering indigenous knowledge in our conversations, but also we need to find and prioritize grassroots movements. So women-led movements that are pushing for energy initiatives that are progressive. We need to ensure that funding is going to those different communities, but also we need to accelerate meaningful and transformative engagement of women in this process. I know there's structures that were mentioned where women can engage, but we need to ensure that it's meaningful and it's transformative engagement so that we're amplifying voices and we're ensuring that the conversation is shaped by the visualities of women in Africa. Thank you.
Some useful food for thought that you have provided us with today, Jennifer. And what you're provoking here is the $1 million question. Who pays for all of it? You know, and it's been at the center of all debates and central to the outcomes of the G20 in Brazil was amplifying the need for a concentrated wealth tax and taxing the super rich. But I'd like to move over to Dr. Mitika. In terms of your reflections, in terms of what should G20 priorities be, particularly for climate change, given that climate change is an intersectional issue? We've heard from all our panelists who've made reference to it as well. But what should we be pushing for, especially in the context of the disappointing outcomes of COP29 in Baku? And also what we're seeing in today's developments with the Trump administration and ramifications therein. So your reflections, Dr. Letitia.
Thank you very much, and it is a big pleasure to also share this platform with very ladies with very impeccable information. So it is now the reverse. Now this is what we call the gender, but the small agenda now in the panel is only the man who is the minority leader. So just as an introduction, my name is Mvika Mwenda, and Paja, for those who are not familiar with it, I represent Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And apparently, the people who are seated here, we are all partners in one other. So, just speaking from my sister who was just spoken, just as a context, you have mentioned that the G20 was established in 1999, but we have to ask ourselves, why was it established? Was it established for the interest of Africa because we are only one African country which is represented, or it was established to advance the hegemony of the big powers, and particularly the United States? So that's question number one. Number two is that to acknowledge that it constitutes, it accounts for 85% of the world economy. And so that should tell you what that means if it sneezes or one of them sneezes. And this again brings me to now the next question of you have asked me about what happened. Don't ask what happened in the US. The election of the Donald Trump, the biggest climate denier in the world. So you ask yourself, what happened is he has overturned the world. The Trump is actually not the accident. It is something which has built the growth of right-wing movement across the world. And that is the pattern which you are seeing all over the world, in Germany, in Europe, even in Scandinavian countries, which we use really to credit with the most progressive issues, migration, climate change, inequality, and all those, democracy and everything. Everything. You see a shifting world to the extreme right. And if the embodiment of that, then is Donald Trump. And you see within 2 weeks, what has happened in the world is really unprecedented. And everyone is feeling the heat that we don't know what will happen tomorrow. Those who work on HIV/AIDS, those who work on climate change, he has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, he has pulled out of the World Health Organization. Everything is wrapped in the world. And so that is the implication of the accumulating power and wealth within a particular group of people. And I have always told people, where is the role of the progressive movement? I have always blamed them, because how come we have reached this level that the right-wing movement? And it's not accidental again. It started with Hitler, when they lost the progressive movement. And they reached that level now. They are at the climax because they are overturned things. For them, it is about them, it is about nationalistic interest, and it is about the bad things humanity. And so, coming then to the question of the shadow of the Trump, of course, we can observe that the world will never be the same again. Whether you are working on health, in humanitarian, in democracy, in climate, migration, you saw the pictures of people. They change. That is not the world which we want to see in the current, in the 21st century. But then coming then to the G20. I was in the COP 29, in fact, and a number of us were there. We fought tooth and nail. What we were fighting for was climate finance. And climate finance, which is equitable, and which is accessible, and which can really support people at the front line of climate crisis. And those people are every crisis I have seen. Those are the same people who are at the front line of the mining challenges we are addressing today. So there is direct proportionality between climate crisis, what we are fighting in that, and even when we are talking about events, when we are talking about inequality, when we are talking about everything addressing climate change is all systems. It is everything we need to work with to do the imperatives of climate justice. And so we were fighting for 1.3 trillion US dollars as the quantum of money we require to address climate crisis, particularly adaptation in Africa. We fought tooth and nail. There was walkouts, there was everything we want with African people and everybody. But what the concession was 300 billion US dollars. If you ask me how that will come, then I will not tell you, because even we have been talking about 100 billion US dollars, it is only OECD which has always said that it delivered. But I am sure none of you have ever seen that money. So where we given this 300, people don't even, when we are going to Belém, we are pursuing now, still fighting for 1.3 billion. But even that 100 billion, we have never seen. In Dubai, in 2028, we were fighting and fought. We told our government, you are going to be deceived by Trump and his proxies. They fought and they were deceived that we are going to give you 700 million US dollars for loss and damage. Eventually, all of them went to singing and celebration, but I did not celebrate. Fagia did not celebrate. Civil society in Africa did not celebrate, because we knew it was an exception. In fact, now those governments are telling us that, yes, I think you are right. We were deceived, so that we passed this in Dubai. 700 billion US dollars is not even a salary for one person, Ronaldo, who plays in Saudi Arabia. But we were celebrating everything about 700. But even then, it didn't come. These are the things which we are really the geopolitics which we find ourselves. So we are going for adaptation, and we will still continue fighting. Ladies and gentlemen, the fight, and I like the spirit of South Africa, that the fight, even in the minds, we need to keep fighting. We need to adopt that spirit. It is not easy. It is about money. It is about resources. We have to fight. Whether we join the G20 as Africa, South Africa has been there. And even when they were there, people died in Marikana. Even when we were there, people are dying. I hear people are being pulled in mines for mines even now. So these are the things we need to overcome. Things. How are we going to do that? Mobilization, generation of green commerce. We need to work together. We need solidarity with the women, the feminist movement. We need solidarity with the inequality movement. We need solidarity with the health movement, with tax justice movement. Let us stop working in isolation. The enemy is so formidable, ladies and gentlemen, that there is nothing we can do alone. Even as we have realized within the climate justice movement that we need others, we need work. Once we generate that critical mass of armies, we are going to defeat the enemy. Trump will not even win. We are going to kick him out of the world. But if we don't unite, I can see we are going to be banished. Are we going to accept that? No. We need to work together. So I would urge that we work together. So the other thing she has mentioned about this just transition, and actually it is apt. Just last week, I was in Tanzania attending African Head of State Summit on energy. You listen to them. It is the same story. It is the same corporations, big companies, big foundations is talking about energy. In fact, I didn't see the people I'm seeing here And that's why I came here. I said I will not attend the meeting. This is where I belong, because this is where the voice of the people is. They are talking about, just a simple voice, they are talking about the actual mission 300. But mission 300 for energy, actually chaired by a woman, one of the most prominent women, Zulu of Tanzania. But we challenge them as the civil society. Is it not going to be the same story? When we are the next summit, how many people will be pulled out of energy poverty? I can assure you it will be the same story. There are 25 renewable energy initiatives in Africa. But why do we have 600 million people in poverty, on energy poverty? It is because we have misplaced priorities. We just only rely on a failed model of development, the top down. We need to promote bottom up, people centered, people owned, people controlled initiatives, and even energy systems, and that is the people which are actually manifesting in this movement. Let us keep fighting. It is not easy, but let us not give up. Thank you very much.
So before we move to wrap up, I also want to give an opportunity to the room, the little time that we have left, to contribute to the discussion as well. I'd like to ask our esteemed panelists that when you respond to the questions coming in, please be concise, but also think about how you also reflect on how civil society can get involved in the G20 process. We are fortunate enough to have the Civil 20 President and Sherpa on stage as well. So any questions, please direct it to the panelists. We'll take a round of 4 hands initially, and then we may possibly do a second round. Do we have roving mics in the room? Roving mic support in the room. Covering my guys, figure it out. Oh, there you are here. Great. So we have one hand here, the next one there, and we have 2 on that side. So we will come back to this actually.
Yeah, thanks to the panel for, I think, a good setting of priorities for G20 as civil society. Andile Zulu from the Alternative Information Development Center, and just 2 points, most of them questions that I think are quite crucial for the room in general. I think one thing that we have to be worried about when it comes to the just transition partnerships is not just the issue of debt and the then outcome of austerity, but we have to be concerned about the conditionalities through which we get finance. In other words, what are the terms and conditions in which finance is given? Because right now, the paradigm of finance is de-risking. The World Bank and the IMF gloat about this all the time. They say in the instances where you can't get domestic resource mobilization, we're going to de-risk green energy projects. In other words, we're going to make them as least costly as possible for investors, and then we'll externalize the costs to citizens. So we're going to lower minimum wage, we're going to get cheap labor, we are going to commodify public services, we are going to privatize state-owned enterprises, and so on and so on. So I think that's something that we really need to look out for, because what this is, it's structural adjustments under the guise of trying to solve the climate crisis. But then the other issue that I think is often missing from civil society when it comes to climate and the just transition is the centrality of workers. Because throughout the whole day, and even in this panel, we're asking questions of how are we going to get them to pay climate reparations? How are we going to get them to change the way in which they give us finance? These are some of the most powerful nations backed by some of the most powerful capitalists in the world. They won't listen to you unless you make them listen to you. And the unfortunate reality is that they cannot make profits without workers. Workers are a vital tool for them to be able to extract, to make profits, to build wealth. And it has only been when workers are organized, militant, and democratically conducting themselves and suspending their labor are you actually able to get leverage against those private institutional investors, against capitalists? So I think we as civil society have to ask ourselves, how do we begin to help building within Southern Africa and beyond the continent a militant democratic workers' movement that will scare institutional investors, capitalists, and states in the global north to the point where they have no choice but to listen to you, because if they don't, they will lose profits and their ability to accumulate wealth.
Thank you so much. My name is Jeff. I'm coming from the Zambia Active President in Zambia. I'm doing my legal studies to the University of Zambia. My question is on the G20. So everyone, I'm doing my legal studies, and you understand that a poor man has no choice. You can't tell a poor man to sit down because he will do what it takes to get the food. And if you look at the establishment of the G20 1997, 98, it was basically because of the crisis in Asia. So basically now the G20's agenda is to maintain the global economy. And when maintaining that means that some economies like African economies must remain behind. And we know that. So my question is, as organizations present here, what are we doing to ensure that our programming to respond to some global body meetings like the COP, these are progressive meetings like the Davos economic meetings where people go and have fun, go and have for these flights and come back every year. I don't trust those meetings. So what are we doing to ensure that our programming at the local level are informed by the people we represent? Because we're going to have projects, we're going to have programs running for 10 years where we say we are impacting local people, impacting local women, yet there's no proper impact. How informed is our programming by the people? Thank you so much.
Okay, my name is Indaba. I'm coming from Zambia, from the Center for Trade Policy and Development. First of all, thanks to our panelists. I think that was quite insightful. You brought out a lot of points. But I think of particular interest to me was the issue of unity. And my question is going to be, how can we get our African leaders united? I think if we're going to have a just energy transition that we're talking about, we need to have a united Africa specifically. For example, I'm talking about Donald Trump and how he's imposing tariffs, but I don't know how many have seen the response from the European Union. So they're giving a collective position, right, with one voice, but I think it's not the case in the African context. For example, take a look at what's happening in ECOWAS. They're already breaking out of the alliance that we have. You look at the East Africa, what is happening, I think it's almost known, especially to those of us who are from South Africa already know what's going on. SADC does the same thing. So how do we get our African leaders to ensure that they're united? Because to have a just transition, I believe we need first of all to transform our economies. And if we're going to transform our economies, especially in Africa, we need to have a collective position. For example, we could have an African industrial policy, which is lacking. So what should we be doing? While we have such insightful conversations, civil society organizations, and also other non-state actors, but I struggle sometimes to get what the so what is. For example, after we've left the alternative mining in Indaba, what should we be doing to ensure that our leaders in our respective countries can be united, they collaborate more without just focusing on our individual countries? Because eventually we're already seeing some of the leaders who are signing deals with the developed countries, even Donald Trump. Some of them are, I'm almost tempted to mention some of the names, but I might be in trouble. But some of them are going, they are seeking to sign deals because of what they are calling the critical minimum. You don't even know these minimums are critical to them. So how do we ensure that civil society organizations, that our leaders can be able to collaborate like what we are seeing in the European Union? Of course, the United Kingdom is the odd one out, but at least they can thank you.
There was one last hand that side, and then we'll come back to the panelists to respond. Comrades, I'm also mindful of time. We are being squeezed a little bit, so let's be concise in our input so that other comrades can also have a chance to contribute.
Thank you. My name is Jimmy Harrison. I'm the community that is coming from Namibia, the West Constituency, which
It was a very critical question that my brother asked here. It was one of the first questions that I wanted to put in the panel. But then for time situation, I will leave it just as my brother said. But then I just want to dig a bit deeper into this beautiful booklet known as the Model Law on Mining on Community Land in Africa. My brothers from Zimbabwe, I think you must be aware of this wonderful book that has been established through the years of 2013 to 2016. If we, the African countries, adapt to this model of laws and influence our legislatures, especially the environmental management laws and mineral prospecting and mining acts, to involve these laws that are within this booklet, then I think we'll be moving in the right direction. But then this will only be happening if we have to unite. So the question again ranges down to why don't we African countries either economically and the type of security unite? Because that is the important one. Secondly, I would like to ask, especially for us now, we are asking the question as to for who is this just energy transition? Instead of asking that question, why don't we say, when are we studying to take responsibility for our resources? When are we mining by ourselves? We have got an example case study of a community of women that is gathered to decide they are going to establish a team processing plant in which they are going to process things by themselves and then they are going to sell it just like other people are doing instead of working. When are we going to adapt to models where we implement such projects in each and every African country to assure that we are the ones that are responsible for mining activities in our country? Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to take one more and then we come back to the panelists. Thank you.
Another speech. My name is Dulce Maria Pereira. I'm a professor at UCT from Brazil. I wanted to ask a few questions very quickly. First of all, do you consider that the world changed completely after the Brazilian G20? For example, that most of the big organizations such as World Bank and all of them took off their platforms. The discussions on hunger, on environment, and on poverty. Secondly, are you considering that the G20 is a meeting of states? And in Brazil, where we were able to include hunger because it was an agenda of the president. I coordinated the women's, technically, the women's group, the first women. And we were able to keep a state's debate pushed with the scientists, pushed with the feminists and with the women's movements. Because we had a government at that time, and I'm not saying that the government is perfect, but at that time we were able to really engage the feminist movement and women's movement with the government to organize the first document we organized. And we had to fight with the countries. Except in South Africa, who supported us at that time, we had to really fight with other countries in order to keep basically the document. And we were only able to do disasters because civil society, against the will of the government, really mobilized, that whole country with an agenda on disasters. That's why that document on disasters is part of that. And then, if you are aware that issue of taxes is now something not to talk about anymore. So how? I think that one of the main issues, and that was what I'm going to ask, because it was also very complicated with the government. How civil society is going, what's the strategy of civil society to convince the government not to boycott the civil society's movements on that? Because even in Brazil, if you think, for example, the youth movement and all the other civil society groups were included after a long time of very, very active struggle of civil society. Finally, what are you thinking about the women issue? Because the women's group of the traditional group of women, energy group, is a group that is organized by business women, and they are there to defend their interests. So we fail on that in Brazil. I came for it. Because we were not really able to have a strong organization of women, women in civil society, you know, and the feminist movement. So please, how are we going to do it? You know, and count on us.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So, in response to my esteemed panelists, comprehensive reflection on what you have heard. I'll give you 2 minutes each so we can wrap it up, but please focus on how civil society can get involved. And to the audience in the room, I know it's a lot of content to take in such a short period of time. We have a dedicated time as well tomorrow through the Ideas Lab, where we will unpack some of these demands and what this really means for us in our programming, in our engagements with women's groups, and mobilizing civil society as well. So we will have dedicated time to unpack it and formulate our own demands, particularly on key questions on the energy transition. Over to you. I'll start from the right towards the left.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I only have two points. One is the fact that the disunity of Africa is by design. And the design is not because Africans do not want to unite. I think there are so many forces that are at play that are part of a larger colonial project to make sure that Africa is not united. And I think we need to be cognizant of that. Otherwise, we are going to victim blame and look at ourselves and say, what is wrong with us? Why are we not united? But what gives me hope is organizations that are regional, like AfroDead and others, that are really bringing civil society, not only across Africa, but across the global south. And I really want to link it to the questions that you asked. How are we going to do it? We are going to lean on Brazil. That's just how we are going to do it. Even right now in our leadership of the C20, part of what we are doing is to talk to Brazil. Understanding, of course, that there are differences. Understanding, of course, that the political climate is a little bit more different. You know, Brazil was handing over to South Africa, India was handing over to Brazil, and even that transition is very different from the transition between Brazil and South Africa. And so we are going to have to be very cognizant about what are some of the things that you managed to do in Brazil. Yeah, I suspected my mic is off. It's just my well-inherited voice that has been killing me. I did not start, but I want to say that Africa is not divided because Africans can't unite. It's a design. We are broken down systematically. Our languages, our institutions, our leaders, you know, and it's a project that has taken many, many years. But we need to lean on regional bodies, regional organizations, forums such as these, to basically bring civil society across geographies. So rather than geographic communities, but communities of practice, and support the work that they do and make sure that they are able to bring various voices together that will at least unite the African voice. The second one is, how are we going to do the wonderful things that you say we need to do? We are going to learn from Brazil and lead on Brazil. There are a number of things that we've already inherited as we take over the leadership of C20. Brazil has been quite generous in giving us some of the lessons that they have that they have learned. Last point, I mean, it's interesting, the questions about these meetings, etc. And I think that it's a very important when people say, what do you achieve? But you ignore them at your own peril. You know, I know that Davos, Oxfam does not go there for lunches, but our global inequality report is launched at Davos. We could launch it in a township in Cape Town or in a township in Kenya. But we are able to enter a space and meet at the table of the superpowers and say to them, as you are negotiating how you are going to slice up the world and how you are going to slice up Africa, there is an issue of inequality. So it's also about how do you strategically use some of these platforms. The issue of labor is an interesting one. Because the labor movement, like Unity in Africa, has been systematically broken down. In South Africa, it was one of the movements that also helped us deliver democracy. So as I said, around how do we speak in a united voices, then there is also a lot of cleaning up we are going to have to do. And even as we talk about labor, somebody here spoke about the care economy. There's a lot of people, even when we talk about labor, that are excluded, and they are mainly women. We have seen in Africa how the labor movement has become patriarchal, and it has been led by men who don't want to recognize the informal economy, women's labor, and in fact have been gatekeepers to make sure that labor of women is not recognized, because they've also been self-interested. In a country like South Africa, we are going to ask ourselves, what has the labor movement achieved once it became part of the tripartite alliance? So in a lot of ways, what is good about crisis is that it allows us to think outside of the box, because maybe it's not like a square box, maybe there's not even a box, maybe it's something else. And also things like automation, the global labor market, and a lot of people, who are operating businesses, and issues like unemployment in South Africa. So this is a time to really think. When we say we want to use labor, which labor are we recognizing? Which one are we not recognizing? Which economy are we talking about? And one of the things that we can do in South Africa as a G20 is to start talking about the fact that there is a thriving informal economy, there is a thriving care economy, and unless you have a gendered look at the economy, you are not going to create an economy for people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to build on what Sam had said and try to answer some of the questions. I think when you're speaking about what we do or what we achieve when we go to these meetings, I think especially with the G20, taking an insider and outsider approach is what we are going for. Organizing on our own, organizing with others, learning from others, and in that way, for example, I think the People Summit is an example of that. And then in terms of the question around labor and workers, I also find that very interesting because, for example, I think we have to again look at building critical mass, and around the G20. Somebody said, it was the agenda of the global north, and what does it mean for us? How do we build this critical mass? How do we, since Lebo mentioned that workers play a crucial part in the liberation struggle of many African countries. So how do we re-radicalize ourselves? I think if we look at the Palestine example, many people in South Africa, for example, took to the streets, but when we looked at our voting, how many people voted for the DA? So how do we then think about what does radicalization mean? What does showing up mean? What does opposing these powers mean? And how many of our captives comfort are we really willing to give up for regaining our power? And so there's also this working class divide, the have and the have not. And what role does the media also play there? So again, it goes to the issue of unity. How do we unify Africa? Because this is a G20 for and by Africa. The G20 is a norm and agenda setting space. How do we come together to push the agenda to change those norms? So we have to think strategically right back, trying to answer your question. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for those reflections, and the thoughts that I had have been brilliantly laid out by Dr. Minister. But I think what's important is to recognize that if we're going to build regenerative economies and well-being economies, we need to build a movement of movements. So we need to connect to labor movements, we need to connect to the debt movement, climate movement, women's movements, feminist movements, and come up with our collective vision of what we're calling this well-being economy and take a systems approach. We cannot do this in isolation. We have been, but like what was mentioned, it is being designed that way, and I think it's time that we call that out and start to connect with each other. I think there are a lot of spaces where we come and connect, so the army is a good space where you see the connection with the climate, we talked about the gender connections, and there are other spaces as well where we meet and connect. So I think it's important that we continue to grow the movement, but also it's important that we highlight feminist consciousness raising when it comes to these issues, so that we understand the systemic issues and where they're rooted from, and also come up with progressive demands and alternatives to the current realities right now. And also just highlighting the inside-outside approach. I think oftentimes when you look at it, you think the outside should assist the inside. But as much as we're organizing on the outside, we need to ensure that we also have people on the inside. Because if we're not on the inside, then we don't know the agenda that's being set. So I think we need to leverage these two approaches in a way that is strategic as well, and yeah, just continue to communicate with each other and continue to grow.
So a number of questions were asked, some of them were rhetorical. So I go direct to what we do as a civil society organization. First, let me say that we cannot unite African leaders. African leaders, most of them are proxies of external powers, and we need to give up on them. I don't support military takeovers of government. Look at what is happening in West Africa. It is the movement of young people which are saying enough is enough. I think first, then we have the power of young people, where you can imagine the demography of Africa. 65% of young people of Africans are 35 years and how do we have on that demography? But also, the issue then of African priorities is we are very good in doing policies. I mentioned that I was in Tanzania. There was a very beautiful Dar es Salaam declaration. There is going to be African Union meeting next week. The heads of state, that the 8 heads of states and governments of the African Union. There are a plethora of them. All of them have a declaration or a decision. They do it and they wait for another year to draft it and then do another declaration. That is not the African one. We want transformation and we are given up. And so, my very few points about civil society organizations is, number one, we need to strengthen North-South collaboration. So how our allies in Brazil do it, how our allies in US, and because it's not only about Trump there. In fact, half of the population is opposed to them. So how do we work with them? Because we cannot work in isolation. So that is very important. Secondly, the South-South collaboration also is very important, but for us in Africa mobilization, without realizing that we cannot work in silos, is very important. And so, the proposal here then is to take example of things. For the G20, we don't look at it at that moment as just a moment. It's not. The G20 in South Africa, there was G20 in Brazil, and it didn't solve the problem. So we take that as part of the larger process of mobilization. And so we link that with the key moments across the world, including what we are doing here. This should be seen as a build-up here and organizing. And so there are so many key moments, Afro-Dance, for instance, and Tax Justice Network leading us in the FFP4 and link that. We have us working on climate and climate justice, take up on the path on the COP20 and the World Social Summit in Qatar, and all those key moments. So we take them as a journey. By the time we reach COP30, then we will have built a very big momentum, which is going to be again hosted. I hope now we are going to meet in Brazil and ensure that we work together. When there is an ongoing economic justice campaign already, which was launched during the UN Civil Society Conference in Nairobi. I think because they have identified the G20 as part of that moment. We need to lead that, but the circle in South Africa as the anchor of that, the South African civil society and the African civil society, so that perhaps what could emerge out of that would be maybe a body-based organizing committee anchored in South Africa, which I know that the C20 manifests that, but also broadened with other movements, so that we build that, and the South Africa provides leadership, so that when it coming in those breakout committees and those others, we are going to be part of it and building on them. If we do that, we are not going to be lamenting that if they have failed us. We are going to continue to tell us, yes, you have failed us, but we are going to get to it forward. Finally, the final point is how I can see my friend Patrick is working out. We need to take Trump as an advantage. We use him as a mobilization. We want to start a campaign on sanctioning Trump and the US. We ban them from any global meeting. Let them stay, we isolate the US because they think that they are the heart of the world. Thank you.
Comrades, thank you for being with us. I will not attempt to summarize the great inputs that we have heard from our panel. All I can say is that we've heard that we really need to act in solidarity to seize this moment. It's only coming back in the next 21 years. So let's contribute to mobilizing. Let's use this as a moment to build on, so that eventually we see a world that is not only free, but equal as well in terms of economic participation and meaningful engagement as well for sustainable livelihoods. With that, please a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much. Okay.
It's been a beautiful session. Please don't walk out just yet. I will make a few last and final announcements. As they silently take their group photos. Sorry, as they are silently taking the group photo, I'm subjecting the book of the announcement for tomorrow. All right, thank you so much. It's been a beautiful day for all of us. I will equally not attempt to summarize the session or summarize the day, because I know we are tired and we would like to break off now. If we are silent for 2 minutes, we should be able to wrap up. Good evening again. Thank you. So we've had a beautiful day, we've had beautiful sessions. The Army still continues tomorrow and the other day. I think there's been a lot of emphasis on working together. We need to be intentional about not working in isolation. There's a saying I've always believed in: the power of the people is always going to be stronger than the people in power. As long as we stay together, we stay connected. Together, we can. There's been several deep conversations and unpacking the critical question of our time: energy transition for who? There's been information overload. I'm sure we'll have a lot of time to digest it overnight as we come back fresh tomorrow. So in terms of announcements, as we end the day, give me a moment. We have a side session tomorrow early in the morning that will be led by Natural Resource Governance Institute. The theme is driving equitable value addition for Africa in global mining supply chain. It will be held here in the Harlem Hall at 7:30 hours to 9 hours. So this is the breakfast session. Please, those that can, make your way to that session tomorrow. Tomorrow we're starting promptly at 9. We have seen how much we've run way over time today because we started a bit late. So we'll attempt to start at 9 tomorrow, whether we have 2 people in the room or 5.
so that we're able to end on time. For the purpose of those that come early, I think it's respectful to respect their time as well, as much as we respect those that come much later. The ideal lab sessions for tomorrow will be shared by email tonight. Please check them out, but they'll also be available at the reception desk as you walk in. Please return all the interpretation headsets and recover your passports and IDs before you leave, so that they don't end up getting misplaced, but also so that you don't lose the headsets home. Please find out about the side events at the hotel reception desk and join in the networking opportunities tonight. So we still have other side events. I know we're tired, but please just find time to support our colleagues, but also just engage with the conversation. Thank you so much for being patient with us. Thank you for a beautiful day, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Done for today. What is the school doing there? What is the school doing? Oh, you're not all the school. I have no idea. We have no idea. I have no idea. São os debates. E o dia foi longo, vocês acompanharam. Para quem acompanhou as sessões, o dia foi bastante longo. Debates. Amanhã depois acompanhou-se da debates de grupos e esta sessão. Esse segundo dia, então nós vamos ficar por aqui até a próxima oportunidade.
You have yes. Yes, they were taking. Why you not taking the whole thing?
Yeah, I'm taking the whole thing.
I want this speech.
You want? Okay, I'll send to you by WhatsApp.
You can send.
I can send to you by WhatsApp. Okay.
Yes. I want this speech. I want.
I like to